Our next speaker is Harold Youmans with the title of Jackson's Martial Law, Prelude for Tomorrow's Debate. Mr. Youmans, Harold W. Youmans, has JD as a historian, reenactor, and lecturer on the War of 1812, as well as the former editor of the Journal of the War of 1812. He contributed to the Encyclopedia of the War of 1812, has made numerous presentations, is a retired colonel in the U.S. Army, and served as a special magistrate and hearing officer for several communities in Central Florida. And he arguably has one of the largest printed material collections on the War of 1812 in private hands. For us at the symposium, he has developed our genre of kind of a legal approach to the Battle of New Orleans over the years. Has been a very frequent contributor. So I'd like to present Mr. Harold Youmans.
Thank you for the reenactor's weather. If I were not here, I'd be standing in the rain over there at Choumette. And I think I made the right decision as to which of the two events I should come to today. That's not saving us from tomorrow, but let's see how it goes. My lovely wife came with me this time. She's grading me today. So if any of you others are grading me, compare with hers, and we'll see how I do. Before we got here, we went on a hot air balloon ride, and several days ago, and we caught a storm, as you can expect, and we came down out of a cloud bank, and we were lost. So she looked and she saw a young man walking across an open field, and of course, if you heard this one, just be patient. She saw someone walking across the open field and says, "Go ahead, go ahead." And I yelled down and I said, "Where are we?" And he looks up and he says, "You're in a hot air balloon." So I looked over at my dear wife and I said, "That is an attorney." Because everything he said was absolutely correct, and everything he said was absolutely worthless. And then she says, "Just like your presentation." Well, let's see. No, she didn't say that. Okay, as you see, I try to pick up a little pictures as I go along, and this is the introductory slide, and we see a picture of the battle and a picture of the statue that you all know. Is there anyone here not from New Orleans? Because Curtis told me, don't tell any anti-New Orleans jokes. I can't talk about Tulane. I can't talk about what's going on downtown. Oh, your traffic is wonderful. No problem. Let's talk about Jackson's martial law. And you had some pretty good presentations this morning. I'm going to go through this chronology very, very quickly. Jackson got here on about the 1st of December, the last time. And by the 16th, he had talked to everybody that he needed to talk to, including Livingston and Claiborne and all of those characters that you see in your history. And he declared martial law. Now, in 1814, if anyone would tell you that they knew what martial law was, it was probably an attorney. But by the 26th, the jails were full, because Jackson and his people had picked up just about everybody that they thought was a risk to the oncoming action. Your state legislature got a little bit excited about the 28th. Jackson started to get rumors that they were about to talk to the British, that they didn't want the town burned down, that all kinds of horrible things were going to happen. And remember, in 1814, this town is less than a decade away from being under the control of the Spanish and the French. And so Claiborne's whispering in Jackson's ear saying, "Bad guys out there. You don't know which side they're going to come down on, and we got to be careful." And Jackson says, "I know exactly how to be careful with them." Well, by January 8th, we see the victory, and that is almost when martial law story starts. On the 21st, you'll remember, no one talked about it yet today, we had the ceremonies down at the cathedral. We had the apostolic delegate give the thanks. About 3 weeks after the battle, the militia, which he kept on the line, by the way, because he didn't know where the British was going, and the intelligence was coming in that saying the British was being reinforced, and they're not ready to quit. You got to remember that Jackson was the one whose face was sliced by a British officer in 1782. Remember, his mother had died while tending to prisoners on a British ship in Charleston Harbor. His brother had died during the war. So he knew that the British were not nice. And he wasn't going to allow them to get in front of him or behind him in any way. February, almost a month after the victory, you see that he had sent Livingston and a couple other guys out to talk to Cochrane about the exchange of slaves and exchange of prisoners, and they were retained in Mobile at the mouth of the Mobile River while the British took Fort Bower. And it was only on the 19th that news of the first news of the treaty came in to New Orleans. Livingston had come back and told Jackson that Cochrane knew. Now, I did a piece about 2 years ago about the legality of the ratification and the legality of when the war was over. In Maine, the war may not be over yet, but that's Maine and not Louisiana. But we have to. Did you know the British occupied Maine until 1819? Well, that's another story. But in any event, by the 19th of February, Governor Claiborne is saying, well, wait a minute, hold it. Isn't this thing over? Isn't over mean over? And Jackson was saying, no way. Okay. February comes, tempers start to rise. The French start getting a little excited. You know who I'm talking about when I say the judge? Judge Dominic Hall. Judge Dominic Hall. Poor Judge Hall. Thrown in the clink. Okay. A French citizen, it's hard to tell back then whether you were a French citizen, an American citizen, a Spanish citizen, or whatever. If you had a consulate in town, and the French did have a consul in town, you could go to the French the consul and say, I think I'm French. He'll look at you and say hello. And you say hello in French. And they say, okay, you're French. And he'd give him a certificate, and then you take that to the American officer and say, I'm not American, I'm French, let me out of the militia. How many times does that have to happen before Andy Jackson says enough? Well, it happened about 100 times apparently, a little less than 100 maybe, but it happened about 100 times, and Jackson says, well, that's higher than the number I can find acceptable, and so therefore, all of you Frenchmen, council of the government of France, out, move out, be 100 miles away in 3 days, out. He pitches Toussaint out of town. The judge starts saying, well, wait a minute, whoa. I read the Constitution before they made me a judge. And Jackson said, I don't care what you're reading. And so a newspaper pops up, and here's a Frenchman. Happens to be a committee chair of the state legislature, and he says, I've had enough. And Jackson says, no, you haven't, and he throws the Frenchman in jail. The judge says, habeas corpus. Really? He throws the judge in jail. The state attorney comes down and says, well, wait a minute, I'm about to issue a habeas corpus writ. Throws him in jail. Anybody else? I'm ready for you all, come on. So he's throwing all these guys in jail, and by the 8th of March, the jail is really full, really full. All right. Well, here comes a guy, and you got to understand that Washington City in 1815 was at 21 days from here by horseback. if the horse don't go lame, if the guy don't fall off, or we don't have any rain, we can make it in 21 days. On the 9th of March, you don't see that up there, on the 9th of March, a horse rides into town from Washington City. Jackson says, the ratification, the peace, it's over. He opens it up and finds out that, yes, the Department of War was the same as the Department of Defense. They put the wrong stuff in the satchel, and there's no indication in the satchel that the war's over. Jackson says, I can understand that. That's my boss. Okay, we continue to what we're doing. On the 14th, another horseman rides into town. He's got the proclamation. There it is. He's got the proclamation in hand. And he says, well, okay, peace. He lets everybody go home. He lets everybody out of jail. He lets everybody court-martialed, reprieved. Everything is going along except there's the judge. Ha! He issues a writ to Jackson for contempt of court. Get your butt in court. Jackson sends his lawyer to court. Jackson's lawyer starts reading. I can go into this thing until the cows come home. He starts reading what Jackson wants him to read, and the state attorney or the federal attorney objects. The judge objects. Everybody objects. Everybody gets thrown out of court. Get Jackson's butt in here. I want to see him, and I'm gonna hit him because nobody puts me in jail. Really. 31st of March, there's a trial. Guess what happened? Jackson gets there. The Baratarians, you remember them pirates? You talked about the pirates? The Baratarians promise him that on his word, he will not only throw the judge into the river, they will tear the building down and throw it into the river. I need guys like that. I needed them in Vietnam, But anyhow, he has a trial. They fine him $1,000 for contempt of court. Jackson takes out what passes for a check back in 1815, writes out a personal check for $1,000, hands it to the judge, and walks out of court. Jackson left the 6th of April. End of the battle, right? End of the war, right? Jackson's going back to Tennessee, right? Boy, oh boy. We have a constitutional conundrum. If you look up that cite to the Constitution, you'll find that it is the cite that says all of us have the right to a writ of habeas corpus. If you don't know what that is when an executive officer puts you under arrest, you have the constitutional right in this country to ask a judicial officer to review the executive officer's actions. If I rescind the writ of habeas corpus, you got no recourse. I can do anything I want to you as an executive, and the judge can't do anything. And if the judge does anything, I'll throw the judge in jail too. Is that the law? Was that the law back in 1814 and 15? And is that the law today? Wow. What is martial law all about? And we find that it is, and again, we can wax poetic about the philosophical roots of nationalism and the philosophical roots of sovereignty and how all of that evolves. I spent 3 years in law school arguing about that, lost every argument that I was in. But we will see, let's look at how it evolved. In 1806, the United States Congress passed a law. It was the law for the management, the internal management of the armed forces of the United States. That was the law. If you're a military guy, you know the UCMJ, Uniform Code of Military Justice. That was the 1806 version of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. We went to war with that law. In 1807, as early as 1807, the Supreme Court was not nearly as important as it is today, but in 1807, the Supreme Court passed two cases that become important to us at this lecture. The two cases are ex parte Swarthart and ex parte Bowman. These were two young men that were picked up during the Aaron Burr conspiracy. If you know what the Aaron Burr conspiracy was, not part of the subject of this talk, but the judges at the Supreme Court said, as we read the Constitution, only the Congress can rescind the writ of habeas corpus. Not the president, not a judge, not a general, and certainly no one in charge of any military operation can do that. That was the rule in 1807. It was not promulgated, and was not promulgated as a precedent case. What was the rule in 1814? The rule in 1814 is, I'm Jackson, I'm the rule. Let's see what happens. Now, you all know, if you're a history buff at all, that we have declared martial law under several circumstances in this country over the last 200 years. We certainly did it during war and insurrection. We see it in Hawaii during World War II. We saw it in the United States, in New Orleans. We've also had civil unrest. As a young lieutenant, my dear sweet wife will tell you that we're sitting in a movie theater in 1968, enjoying some movie that was really a nice movie, I suppose. The screen went blank. It said, all officers report to their duty stations. And in about 24 hours, I was standing on the corner of 14th Street and Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C. Someone had killed Dr. Martin Luther King. We were on civil disturbance duty in 1968. Was that martial law, or was it simply civil disturbance duty? Okay, civil unrest, natural disasters. How about Hurricane Katrina? Did you know they declared martial law here under that law that they had, right? They rescinded the law because all 50 governors came in and said, whoa, 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 wait. Because if you can do this to New Orleans, you can do this to Minneapolis. Or if you can do this to New Orleans, you can do this in New York City. And we ain't gonna have any of that. And so that law's been rescinded. But they declared martial law here, didn't they? Yes. They sure did. Yes. All right. Who declared it? I think it was the president declared it under that federal law that they passed, but it wasn't really one of those federal laws that you see the Congress voted on. It's like one of those 50% deals that the Democrats like to do to the Republicans and the Republicans like to do to the Democrats, and that's how they passed that, okay? All right. Well, in 1840, there's an old picture of old Andy Jackson, and he still has a sting. He still has something sitting in his throat. And that thing sitting in his throat is that $1,000 fine. And he says, I was right. Now, all you guys that think that I'm a good guy, we're going to go to Congress and we're going to kick butt. I didn't read you something here. My son told me to tell you this. History exists to be retold. Alas, with more panache. But not necessarily with greater accuracy. Always think my son is looking after me. My other son wrote another one for me. I'll give you that one in a minute. But in any event, 1840, if you understand your history, the Jackson Democrats are really Democrats, and they're the direct descendant, they are the ancestors of today's Democrats, okay? The Whigs was a party that was prominent in the mid-century. They died out. Most of them became Republicans, and we'll see in 1862, 63, 64, they're called Republicans, but the same guys that were Republicans in 62 were Whigs in 42. Go figure. This was an editorial in the New York Daily Tribune. This question is complicated, and the settlement dangerously protracted to subserve the purposes of gambling demagogues who would sacrifice hundreds of thousands of lives to secure for themselves 3 moves forward on the chessboard. There's nothing to do here except to satisfy pride, obstinacy, party intrigue, and criminal ambition. That was in yesterday's Times? No, that was December 9th, 1847. So not too much has changed, I don't think, in the political world. So the argument is, was Jackson right? Was Jackson wrong? I will tell you that after an election in which the Whigs got wiped out, the Democrats got the majority of both houses of Congress, the petition to refund the $1,000 passed overwhelmingly. Did it pass because Jackson was right, or did it pass because Jackson was Jackson? I'll leave that to your tender. Yeah, the real issue in all of these things from 1840 on with respect to martial law is who has power in Congress, who has power in the White House, who has the power to appoint judges. Oh, wait a minute. Is there an inauguration coming up soon? Okay. Where does the power lie? And in 1842, the same argument, but what they rose was the issue of necessity. That was the argument on the pro-Jackson side. It was necessary in order to execute the win. So we see, if I go back and I say, remember those articles, the 1806 articles? They started back in 1776. Duane was a Democratic Republican at that point, Democrat, and he had a lot to say about it. Andy Jackson came to the fore in 1815. Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War. Why was Jackson wrong and Lincoln right? Think about it, folks. If Jackson was right, Lincoln was right. Oh, by the way, all of the people who said Lincoln was right in 61 were the people who said Jackson was wrong in 41. Why? Where you stand depends on where you sit on this issue, folks. But martial law grew out of military law. Military law was the management of the armed forces. Martial law is the management of civilians in the area. Okay? So by 1861, we have a situation where martial law is emerging out of military law and becoming to stand on its own. If I went to law school in 1870, I would be studying military law and martial law because they were separate at that point. Okay. What's important about martial law? First, who initiates it? The general in the field? The president back in Washington? The Congress, wherever that is, on vacation? Can a judge do it? Can someone less than a general do it? In Maine, it was a colonel. Over what area can I institute martial law? Let me tell you what Jackson said something very interesting. He said, New Orleans is my military camp, and I am in charge of my military camp. And if you are in my military camp, I am in charge of you. Now, remember where Jackson Barracks is, right up the road here? Okay. It wasn't Jackson Barracks in 1815, by the way. It didn't become Jackson Barracks until 1861. If you didn't know that, walk away with something you know now. But if I restrict martial law to my tented area, that's a much smaller area than my camp. So Jackson said the entire camp. In Michigan, the British said the entire territory. In Maine, they said everything north of the Penobscot River. We went back in the early part of 1815 when we went into Canada, we declared martial law in the entire country, well, it wasn't country then, in the entire territory that was Canada. So how wide an area becomes important, because if you're going to declare martial law, you better have the troops to do it, right? And for how long? Did Jackson keep martial law in effect too long? Did he keep it in effect long enough? Now, I can't talk about the psychology of people who were born in New Orleans. That was one of the things you told me not to talk about. But are you ready for martial law today? Are you ready for a Jackson-imposed type of martial law today? Let's see if we are. By the 1870s, several other things came into effect, and it began to affect what we think about martial law. Anybody know what posse comitatus was? That was essentially a law that was made at the end of the Civil War period that says the United States Army cannot be used to enforce civil law. That got the United States Army out of Reconstruction. And that was a compromise, and the South liked it, the North didn't. What did we do with the cavalry out west? The cavalry commander at Fort Apache had civil authority until we got enough judges and lawyers out there. God almighty, that's terrible. The Civil Rights Act of 1861 was passed. I'm sorry, 1871. That was passed. That had to be passed because of the three constitutional amendments that talked about the abolition of slavery and who was a citizen and all that stuff. So we have now, by the end of the 1870s, we have a clear separation of martial law and military law, and military law then begins to shrink, martial law begins to expand, and let's see what happens over the next 100 years. Good Lord, now we got three to deal with, military government. After the Second World War, several of you are my age, after the Second World War, as a young child, I accompanied my father, who was assigned to American Military Government Italy. And he was a court clerk. Bottom picture. That's a court session in northern Italy. We ran Italy. We were the government in Italy. We had jurisdiction over life, liberty, property, and yes, there were some Italians executed under military government law. Wow. So in the 100 years after the passage of posse comitatus, under certain circumstances, the Army's right back in administering civil law. So from the 1960s on, you see three branches, but it's still necessity versus habeas corpus as far as American citizens are concerned. There was no authority in Italy to control American citizens in Italy. If an American citizen in Italy got in trouble, he was sent home and he was tried at home. There was no American civil law in Italy. But again, military government is another whole subject. Could keep you up here a week on that stuff. So where are we today? Pick which one of the four, pick, where are you? Are you progressive or are you conservative? Are you leaning left or leaning right? Are you young? You don't think I'm going to say old, do you? Is it them versus us? Is it them versus us? Will we declare martial law on the Texas border and not declare martial law in Minnesota? Think about it, folks. If you're going to talk about martial law, you better think about these things. Look at that headline. Is Army preparing for civil unrest? Good Lord. Some people say, yes, go. Other people say, you've got to be kidding me. We can't get out of the motor pool. That's not true. It's not true. Okay. Thaddeus Holt. Thaddeus Holt was an assistant secretary of the Army when I was at the Pentagon, And I had a conversation talking to him. He's written a lot about it. He didn't write because of my conversation with him, but I happened to talk to him, okay? But what is martial law today? Now, I'm going to go back and I can wax poetic about this. Let's talk about nationalism. Is nationalism really natural law? Isn't Jefferson right when he talks about the basis for the Declaration of Independence and the basis of the Constitution is really based in natural law? Don't we have a right to self-defense? Don't we have the right to protect our families, to protect our children, to protect our neighborhood, to protect our home? And if we have a right to protect ourselves, do we have the right to seek the assistance in protecting ourselves? And if we have the right to seek assistance to protect ourselves, should we choose the least effective or the most effective? The police department can't handle it. There are 47,000 looters downtown. I got 12 cops. Where's the National Guard? Who, Mr. Holt said, Professor Holt, who will maintain order, protect persons and property, and set the humanitarian standards? Who will do that? Oh, by the way, this is not history. This is argument. Okay, okay, but it's an issue for today, and that's why the title, Prelude to Tomorrow's Debate, because tomorrow, or at least sometime after the 20th, you're going to have a debate on the proper use of the armed forces domestically. I'm not saying I'm right, I'm not saying I'm wrong, I'm just saying that there's a longer history here, and it's a good thing to know the history before you try to make any affirmation. Let's look at Jackson. Was what he did necessary? And you could analyze that and say, okay, he's got all of these foreign nationals in town. He's got the legislature going against him. He's got the governor saying release the troops. He's got the Baratarians out there, and yeah, it turns out that everybody was probably loyal. When it got down to it, they all decided that Jackson was going to save them. But when it got down to it, they all decided that Jackson stayed in New Orleans too long. How much control is total control? How much control are we as citizens, or they as citizens, how much control were they willing to accept? And as the weeks rolled by, and as after the main battle on January 8th, it got worse and worse and worse and worse. And there was apparently an upper limit to control. I'm not saying where that was, but each of us will say where that was. Define civil unrest. I had to go to Baltimore in October. What was happening in Baltimore in August? What was happening in New York? What was happening in Washington, D.C.? What was happening in a great many of our metropolitan areas, of which New Orleans is one of our great metropolitan areas? What is civil unrest? When does rowdyism become unrest? When the governor squeals and says, help. When the mayor squeals and yells, help. What is civil unrest? Because you got to be thinking about these things, folks. Jackson didn't give anybody in New Orleans the opportunity to think about these things, but we are 202 years away from Jackson, so think about it. And isn't the whole thing based on what our political view is? If I am a civil libertarian, I am going to marry the writ of habeas corpus. I'm going to carry a blank one around in my pocket, because every time something happens, I'm going to pull that out and I'm going to say, sign this, Judge, and that's going to be the end of it. Right? Unless I banned the writ of habeas corpus. That's what's standing between the civil libertarians today and martial law, right? And that was standing between the civil libertarians of 1815 and martial law. It hasn't changed all that bit. Well, do we have the patience to talk about sovereignty? Let's go back and talk about the Treaty of Westphalia at 1688. That set the nation-state system on its path. Are we very near the end? You know, the problem with us is that we live too long. When the average age was 45 years old, we didn't see these changes occur. But think about my sainted mother-in-law. She was born the year the first flight flew, and she saw the people land on the moon. 100 years ago, she would never have lived that long. Do we need to have a discussion about sovereignty? This is not history, this is politics. Okay. Natural law, self-defense. What about strategy and tactics? If you knew that the Army Field Manual covering this still existed, would you insist that the Army Field Manual be repealed and burned? Should we train the Army to cope with civil unrest? Don't be quick to say yes, don't be quick to say no, because, did I go? Oh, Roosevelt. Everybody likes Teddy, right? San Juan Hill, Rough Riders, all that stuff. Who do you think the greatest president, who do you think the greatest general in the United States Army was when he was writing in 1882? He wrote a book about his hero, Andy Jackson. Now, if you know what Teddy did, you get a little bit of Andy in Teddy's personality, right? Okay, but Teddy said Andy was the best. I'm flipping my pages here so I get to the right wording here. Please excuse me for a minute. There we go. Will we ever have martial law in the United States again? Think about it. Who's going to do it? President? Governors? Legislatures? Courts? Can the Supreme Court declare martial law? Don't put it past them. Depends on who you put on the court. Okay. I'm going to give you 3 scenarios, and this is pretty much the end there, Dr. Curtis, Dr. Manning. First name's Curtis. You know, if you live in Florida long enough, you sort of merge present and past. Washington, D.C. area is struck by a nuclear device delivered by a terrorist. The vice president, visiting on the West Coast at the time, considers martial law. He is in contact with the few members of Congress who survived the nuclear explosion. And at the time, and with their agreement, he suspends the writ of habeas corpus and declares nationwide martial law. Is that likely to occur? And if it is, what is the downside of that? What is the upside of that? Second scenario. A major hurricane hits the Florida southeast coast. Thousands are dead in the Miami area. Billions in property damage. Electrical power systems are completely beyond immediate repair. Business and governmental districts are on fire, and the fires are raging. Looting is prevalent. The president declares martial law, suspends civil liberties, and sends in the United States Army. Is that likely to occur? Has it recently occurred? Scenario number 3. There is a medical pandemic of a previously unknown or undiagnosed illness in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Hospitals are overwhelmed. The courts are suspending operations. More than 1 million people are ill, 200,000 dead within a week. The president declares martial law on the same day that Congress suspends the writ of habeas corpus. The National Guard of Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania are brought into federal service. Due to illnesses, the Guard fails to fully respond. Is that likely to happen? Now, you can say no to all three of those scenarios, but those are the classic scenarios. One having to do with natural disasters, one having to do with civil unrest, the other having to do with war, if you believe that the terrorist threat to the United States is war. Okay? If you don't believe any of that stuff, then you'll go another direction. And in the end, you got to remember that you're still in that hot air balloon. Do we have any questions? Ho! Oh, wait a minute. You know, up until 2011, I was a lawyer. And so my answer to you is, who's paying my fee? Hope there's no lawyers in here. I wouldn't want to raise your self-esteem at all. This is a difficult issue. This is an issue for all of us. What I would probably say is good in one situation might be bad in another situation. But that's the essence of leadership, isn't it? Leaders make decisions. There's two famous quotes. First one is, we get the government we deserve. And the second is, elections matter. Get ready, folks. You got an adventure coming up, I think. Of course, in 2008, you had another adventure coming up. And in 2001, you had another adventure coming up. That's for you.
Okay, great. I'm gonna. And of course, want to present our appreciation and small honorarium, and thank you very much, as usual. All right, thanks a lot.